cartoons had faded out. The house had gone quiet, and a 6-year-old girl was falling asleep in her grandmother's bed, wearing a borrowed nightgown. It was a kind of summer night that feels sealed off from harm, soft lamplight in the living room, a couch pulled out for Grandma, and the last comfort childhood before sleep takes over. Then screaming split the dark. She ran toward the sound and found violence waiting for her. Minutes later, she woke up covered in blood, half blind, stumbling through a house that no longer made sense. Her grandmother lay face down. The phone had been thrown outside, and when the little girl finally found help, someone began placing a name in her mouth before she could understand what she had seen. That name would send an innocent man to prison while the real killer stayed free. This is the murder of Judith Johnson. On June 7, 1998, summer had barely begun in Barberton, Ohio, and 6-year-old Brooke Sutton expected nothing more than a quiet night at her grandmother's house. She had just finished kindergarten. Earlier that evening, she and her grandmother, Judith Johnson, had gone to a cousin's birthday party. By the time they returned home, the night felt settled and ordinary. They ate dinner, watched cartoons, and moved through the kind of routine that children remember as safety. Judith, who everyone called Judy, gave Brooke her own bedroom for the night and stretched out on the living room couch. Judith was 58 years old and deeply devoted to her only granddaughter. Brooke adored her just as much. Judy was more than a grandmother. She was a person who made sleepovers feel special, who tucked Brooke into bed, who made the world seem small and kind. Brooke changed into one of Judy's nightgowns, climbed into bed, and drifted off to sleep, believing the house was still wrapped in that same calm. Sometime in the dark hours after midnight, screaming tore through the silence. Brooke woke suddenly and ran toward the sound. What she reached was not confusion or a bad dream. Someone had broken into the house and attacked Judith with extreme violence. Brooke caught only a glimpse of terror before panic took over, and she ran back toward the bedroom. The intruder heard her, followed, and struck her hard enough to knock her unconscious. When Brooke came to, she was badly injured and barely understood what had happened. Blood covered her. One side of her face was so damaged that she could only see out of one eye. The house around her had become unfamiliar, a place of overturned order and terrible stillness. She stumbled from the bedroom into the living room and found Judith lying face down. Brooke tried to wake her grandmother, but Judith did not move. The child began searching for a phone. It took time she did not have and strength she did not really possess. Eventually, she found the phone outside in the bushes, where it had been discarded. She was panicked, hurt, and disoriented. She could not remember how to call the police. Instead, she dialed the only number she knew by heart and left a message at a friend's house, a frightened child's plea reaching into the dark with no idea if anyone would hear it. Only then did Brooke realize the blood on the phone was her own and her grandmother's. She touched the side of her face and felt the injury for the first time. Terrified, she ran down the street looking for help until she reached the home of a neighbor, 25-year-old Tonia Braziel. Tonia knew Brooke. Her daughters were close friends with the little girl. Brooke was crying, bleeding, and in clear pain. She had just come from a house where her grandmother lay dying. What happened next shaped the entire case. Instead of calling for an ambulance or the police, Tonia began steering Brooke toward a name. In the confusion of that morning, while Brooke was exhausted, injured, and traumatized, the idea that her uncle Clarence Elkins was responsible started to take hold around her. Brooke had not seen the attacker clearly. She had seen only a figure in the dark. But with each repeated suggestion, the story hardened. Tonia left Brooke outside for a long time while she got her own children ready. Then she drove the child to her mother April's house and spoke for her before Brooke could fully speak for herself. By the time Brooke reached the hospital, the accusation had already started moving faster than the facts. Inside intensive care, she was pressed for answers. Brooke said she had not clearly seen who attacked her grandmother. That uncertainty did not slow anything down. She was pushed until the frightened 6-year-old repeated the idea already planted in her head. Even then, she did not say with certainty that it was Clarence. She said the man might have looked like him. That was enough. Within an hour of Brooke arriving at the hospital, officers stormed toward Clarence Elkins. At the time, Clarence was home with his wife Melinda and their 2 sons. He had no idea that Judith Johnson had been murdered or that his own niece had been drawn into identifying him. Suddenly his yard filled with shouting officers, weapons, and commands. He stepped outside confused and unprepared, and the scene escalated almost immediately. Melinda ran toward the chaos only to be stopped and told that her husband was being arrested for the murder of her mother. The accusation shattered the family in a single moment. Judith Johnson was not only Brooke's grandmother, she was Melinda's mother. That made the charge feel even more absurd to Melinda, who knew Clarence had been home with her all night. She also knew what kind of man he was. He was not violent. He had never given her any reason to believe he could commit a crime like this. Yet none of that mattered once the machinery of the case had begun moving. Their home was searched from top to bottom. Nothing tied Clarence to the crime. No blood, no weapon, no physical evidence. Still, the case closed around him with alarming speed. The focus stayed almost entirely on Brooke's wounded and manipulated memory. Melinda's account of the night was dismissed. Her certainty that Clarence had been home was treated as loyalty rather than fact. The absence of evidence did not slow the charge. It only made the rush feel more reckless. Soon Clarence stood in court facing a stack of accusations, so severe they threatened to erase his life. He was charged not only with killing Judith Johnson, but also with sexually assaulting Judith and Brooke and brutally attacking the child. The death penalty loomed over the case. What had begun with a terrified 6-year-old repeating a suggestion had turned into a prosecution built to destroy a man forever. As the case moved forward, Melinda watched her world collapse from every direction. She lost her job. She lost her home. The family became isolated. At Judith's funeral, the distance between them and everyone else could be felt in every stare and every silence. Brooke was still recovering from the attack. April was grieving her mother and trying to make sense of her daughter's trauma. The entire family had been split apart before any real truth had emerged. For Melinda, the loss cut through old layers of pain as well. Years earlier, Judith had revealed a secret that changed Melinda's understanding of her own life. Judith had told her that she was not her biological mother. Melinda had been one of the stolen babies connected to the infamous Hicks Clinic in Georgia, where newborns were sold to adoptive parents under false pretenses. Judith had not known the full truth when she adopted her. Once they learned what had happened, mother and daughter began searching for Melinda's biological roots together. Just weeks before Judith's murder, they had even appeared on national television as part of that search. That history mattered because it showed what Judith truly was to Melinda. Whatever blood said, Judith had been her mother in every way that counted. Her murder was not a distant tragedy for Melinda. It was the destruction of the woman who raised her, loved her, and stood beside her. Clarence's arrest did not bring justice closer. It pushed it farther away. When the trial began, the defense was badly overmatched. No DNA testing was done. No physical evidence linked Clarence Elkins to the crime. The case rested on Brooke's childhood testimony. Tony Abrazel's version of what Brooke had said at the door, an emotional force of a brutal murder. Brooke, still a child, was asked to point out the killer in court. Surrounded by adults who had spent years telling her what happened, she turned and pointed at her uncle. It was a moment that hit Clarence with the full weight of betrayal. Not because Brooke meant to betray him, but because she had been placed inside a story she was too young to resist. Tonia's testimony made the damage worse. As the adult witness who claimed Brooke had repeated Clarence's name over and over, she gave the accusation a false sense of certainty. What had begun as suggestion became corroboration. What had begun as confusion became evidence. The jury heard the desperate answering machine message Brooke had left after the attack. They saw the horror of the crime scene. In that atmosphere, doubt was drowned out. Clarence avoided the death penalty, but the verdict still buried him. He was convicted on the remaining counts and sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. An innocent man was taken from the courtroom and sent into one of Ohio's harshest maximum security prisons. He had been 35 years old, a husband and father, when the case began. Now he faced the prospect of dying behind bars for crimes he did not commit. Melinda did not accept it. Once the trial ended, whatever faith she had in the system broke apart. She no longer believed the truth would surface on its own. If Clarence was going to be saved, and if Judith Johnson was going to receive real justice, she would have to do the work herself. She had no training in homicide investigations, no background in forensics, no legal power. What she had was certainty, anger, and endurance. She started with books, libraries, early internet searches, and every piece of information she could gather about men in the area with histories of breaking into homes, attacking women, or harming children. She built a list that grew past 100 names. Then she began doing something almost unbelievable. She approached those men herself, struck up conversations, pretended interest when necessary, and collected whatever traces of DNA she could get. Cigarette butts, hair, drinking containers. Items went into her freezer until it looked less like a kitchen and more like a private evidence room. For more than 3 years, Melinda lived a double life. During the day, she worked to support her sons. At night, she hunted for a man who had really entered Judith's house. The deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. Barberton was a small place. People talked. Her sons sensed the danger before they fully understood it. They slept with knives under their pillows because they feared the real killer might realize they were getting close. The search also drained her financially. In the early 2000s, each DNA test cost hundreds of dollars. Testing every suspect on her list was impossible. Eventually, Melinda realized she needed to go back to the person who had stood closest to the crime and furthest from the truth. She needed Brooke. That meant facing April again. Since Clarence's conviction, the sisters had barely spoken. The murder, the trial, and conviction had torn them apart. Melinda drove to April's home carrying years of grief and anger with her, unsure whether the door would even open. When it did, the reunion came with tears instead of rejection. The bond beneath the damage had not fully died. It had only been buried under loss. Brooke was 10 years old by then, old enough to understand more than she had at 6. When Melinda asked her the question that had been waiting for years, Brooke answered without hesitation. She had never been certain it was Uncle Clarence. The words cut through the entire case. Brooke explained that she had only thought the man might have looked like him, and that adults around her had pushed the idea until it became the answer everyone wanted. In that moment, years of certainty inside the family began to collapse. Melinda laid out her investigation on April's kitchen table. It was thick with names, timelines, and notes gathered over 3.5 relentless years. April listened. Slowly, the possibilities she had resisted came into focus. Clarence may have been innocent from the beginning. Brooke soon recanted her trial testimony, explaining that she had been influenced by the adults around her and no longer believed her uncle was the attacker. Even that was not enough to free him. The recantation was dismissed as coaching. The same logic that should have raised alarms about Brooke's original statement was now used against her second one. Time passed. Clarence remained in prison, but the case had finally attracted the attention of someone who understood what modern forensic science could do. Mark Godsey, a law professor and director of the Ohio Innocence Project, took interest in Clarence Elkins' conviction. Unlike the trial that had sent Clarence away, this new effort focused on DNA. The original biological evidence from a 1998 attack was tested with newer methods. The results ruled Clarence out. They also ruled out the many men Melinda had tracked down herself. That should have changed everything. The man in prison was excluded by the science, and the real attacker's DNA was still there, waiting to be named. Yet even after those results came back, a new trial was denied. Clarence remained behind bars while the truth sat just out of reach. By then, he had spent nearly 7 years inside. With every legal setback, Melinda pushed harder. She began thinking differently about where the answer might be hiding. If the real killer was as violent as the crime suggested, there was a chance he had committed other offenses and ended up in prison too. In that case, Clarence might be closer to the truth than anyone realized. That possibility turned him into part of the investigation. Inside Mansfield Correctional Facility, Clarence began paying attention to the men around him. Outside, Melinda kept looking for names that matched the profile of the real attacker. Then one day she read a local newspaper story about a man named Earl Mann. He had been convicted of molesting children. At the end of the story was a name Melinda had never forgotten: Tony Abrazel. Earl Mann was her longtime boyfriend. The connection was impossible to ignore. Tony was a neighbor who had failed to help Brooke properly, the witness who had helped steer blame toward Clarence, and now she was linked to a violent repeat offender with a history that echoed the Judith Johnson attack. Earl Mann had broken into homes before. He had attacked women and children before. He had been released from jail on June 5, 1998, just 2 days before Judith was murdered. He had also been seen with Tonya soon after Clarence's arrest. Then came an even stranger twist. Out of all the prisons in Ohio, all the housing units, and all the possible placements, Earl Mann ended up in the same prison block as Clarence Elkins, only 3 cells away. The odds of it happening were tiny, but it happened. Clarence watched him more closely. Earl Mann was dangerous, unpredictable, and intimidating. At one point, Clarence saw him violently attack another inmate in the yard. Whatever doubts remained began to shrink. Melinda understood that suspicion alone would not free her husband. She needed Earl Mann's DNA. Since Earl kept his head shaved, hair was not an option. Clarence had to get something Earl had touched and preserve it without being caught. For months he waited. In the summer of 2005, he finally saw the opportunity. Earl put out a cigarette in a makeshift ashtray and walked away. Clarence moved in, picked up the cigarette but with clean tissue, and hid it inside his Bible to flatten and protect it until he could send it out. A few days later, Earl Mann was transferred to another prison. If Clarence hadn't missed that single chance, the trail might have gone cold again. The sample reached Melinda, and the testing was done quickly. The answer came back with the force of an explosion after years of darkness. Earl Mann's DNA matched the biological evidence from the crime scene. The man who murdered Judith Johnson and attacked Brooke Sutton had finally been identified, and the breakthrough had come not from the original investigation, but from the family that had been destroyed by it and from the innocent man sitting in prison. Even then, the fight was not over. Another motion failed before higher pressure forced the case to be reconsidered. At last, after nearly 7 years behind bars, Clarence Elkins was released and allowed to come home. The moment should have felt like a full victory, but nothing about the case allowed simple endings. Too much had been broken. Too many years had been lost. Too much damage had settled into every branch of the family. The prosecution of Earl Mann lasted another 3 years. During that time, the strain on everyone involved became impossible to ignore. Brooke grew into adolescence carrying chronic nightmares and the weight of what had happened to Clarence, even though she had been a child when adults shaped her memory. Melinda and Clarence, reunited after years of separation and trauma, could not hold their marriage together. They divorced in 2006, long before Earl Mann finally faced the end case. When the final reckoning arrived, Earl Mann was convicted of Judith Johnson's murder and sentenced to 55 years to life. The legal record finally reflected what the truth had always been. Clarence Elkins had never killed Judith. Brooke Sutton had never deliberately accused an innocent man. The original case had been a chain of fear, suggestion, tunnel vision, and failure, with a real killer hiding in plain sight while another man served time for him. Some of the damage could never be reversed. Clarence lost 7 years of his life inside a maximum security prison. His sons grew up under the shadow of a conviction that never should have happened. Brooke lived with severe trauma and guilt that did not belong to her. Melinda gave years of her life to proving what should have been obvious from the beginning, that the wrong man had been taken and the right one had been left free. Over time, the family found ways to keep moving. Melinda remarried and eventually returned to the search that she and Judith had once shared, working to help other Hicks Clinic adoptees uncover their origins. Clarence slowly rebuilt himself as well. He remarried in 2010 and remained close to Melinda's family. Most importantly, he never blamed Brooke. He understood what had been done to her. He knew she had been a frightened 6-year-old child pulled into an adult disaster she could not control. That forgiveness mattered because it gave Brooke something the system never had. It gave her a path out of shame. Clarence made it clear that she had nothing to be forgiven for. The people who failed her were the adults who should have protected her, listened to her carefully, and recognized the difference between a child's uncertainty and a solved case. Not everyone involved ever faced consequences. Tonya Braziel, whose actions helped set the false accusation in motion, was never held accountable before her death in 2024. The institutions that had ignored warning signs and forced a weak case to trial did not fully repair what they had done either. Clarence eventually reached a settlement with the state of Ohio and the Department of Police worth more than $6 million. But the money could not return the years taken from him or erase the fear, grief, and humiliation his family carried through that period. In the end, the story of Judith Johnson's murder became two stories bound together. One was the story of a 58-year-old woman killed in her own home, and a 6-year-old girl left bloodied and terrified in the night. The other was a story of how easily the search for justice can be bent when panic and certainty rush ahead of truth. Judith lost her life. Brooke lost her childhood innocence. Clarence lost 7 years. Melinda lost nearly everything while trying to stitch the truth back together by hand. Yet the truth did surface, not because the case was handled well, but because the people most devastated by it refused to stop. A grandmother's murder, a child's trauma, a family's collapse, a prison cell, a cigarette hidden in a Bible, and years of relentless work finally brought the right name into the light. Judith Johnson did not get justice quickly. Clarence Elkins did not get freedom when he should have. Brooke Sutton did not get protection when she needed it most. But after years of distortion and pain, the real story was finally forced into the open, and the man who had done it could no longer hide inside someone else's punishment.